What happens when the most feared man in Montreal hires the one woman every other employer turned away? And his broken little girl refuses to let her go. Céleste Okafor had $43 in her checking account, a disconnected hydro notice tucked under her apartment door, and exactly one interview lined up for a Wednesday afternoon in October. She wasn't picky. She hadn't been picky in a long time. She was 26 years old, 5'3", and 260 pounds of woman who had spent the better part of her adult life being looked through, talked over, and turned down. She'd grown up in Point St. Charles, the second daughter of a Nigerian father who drove a taxi 16 hours a day and a Haitian mother who cleaned offices downtown until her knees gave out. Hard work was the family language. Quitting was a word they didn't teach, but the cleaning company that had employed Céleste for 3 years had quietly dissolved in September, and the temp agency she'd registered with had sent her exactly one placement, a 2-day data entry job that paid just enough to cover her transit card. Her landlord, Mr. Dilt, Westmount, was not a patience man. He'd knocked twice already that week. The call came from a woman named Mrs. Fortier, who worked for a private placement firm operating out of a discreet office on de la Montagne. Her voice was clipped, professional, and faintly apologetic in a way that made Céleste hold the phone tighter. The position is residential. Live-in. A private estate in Westmount. The client requires a full-time household manager with childcare responsibilities. The compensation is extremely competitive. Mrs. Fortier paused. I should tell you that we have placed 4 candidates in this role over the past 8 weeks. None of them lasted beyond the first few days. Céleste looked at the disconnection notice on her kitchen table. What happened to them? The child, Mrs. Fortier said carefully, is going through a very difficult period. How old? 3. Céleste almost laughed. I used to calm down a 40-year-old man having a breakdown in a Tim Hortons at 2 in the morning. I can handle a 3-year-old. There was a pause on the line. I genuinely hope so, Mrs. Fortier said, and she sounded like she meant it. The estate was on a quiet, tree-lined street where the houses didn't have numbers you could see from the road. Céleste arrived by cab, the last extravagance she allowed herself before the money ran out entirely, and stood at an iron gate that looked like it had been designed to keep out small armies. 2 men in dark coats stood at the entrance. They looked at her the way people always looked at her, taking stock, calculating, finding the sum underwhelming. She told herself it didn't matter. She'd been telling herself that since grade 6. The gates opened. The house was enormous in the way that some Westmount properties are. Not flashy, not glass and steel modern, but old stone and iron, and the kind of weight that comes from generations of money and silence. Every window was lit. A woman in her 50s with steel grey hair met Céleste at the door and introduced herself as Sylvie, the head of household staff. She walked Céleste through marble corridors without speaking, her footsteps precise and measured, until they reached a set of double doors at the end of a hallway lined with closed-circuit cameras. He'll see you now, Sylvie said, and opened the door without knocking. The man behind the desk didn't look up immediately. He was reading something, one hand resting flat on the surface, the other lifting a glass of amber liquid. When he finally raised his eyes, Céleste understood what people meant when they talked about a room changing temperature. His name was Luca Ferrante. She knew the name. Everyone in Montreal knew the name, even if most people didn't say it out loud in certain neighborhoods. He was 41, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and eyes that were the particular shade of gray that looks almost black in low light. He was handsome in a way that felt deliberate, like even his face was a negotiating tactic. He looked at Céleste the way he probably looked at everything, as a problem to be assessed. You're the replacement, he said. His voice was low and carried a trace of something. Sicilian grandmother, she'd later learn. Not a question, a verdict. Céleste Okafor, she said, from the Fortier agency. I know who you are. He set down the glass. I also know you've been out of work for 6 weeks. You have no formal childcare certifications, and your last position was cleaning commercial offices in Griffintown. He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Pure information. Pure dismissal. Mrs. Fortier has sent me a pediatric nurse, a certified child behaviorist, and a woman who once ran a daycare in Laval for 12 years. My daughter sent all of them home. Céleste kept her hands still at her sides. Then maybe the problem isn't the credential. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth. More like the particular stillness that comes before a person decides whether to pay attention. My daughter's name is Mathilda, he said. She's 3 years old. Her mother died 14 months ago, a car accident on the Champlain Bridge. He said it the way men like him said hard things, not without feeling, but with the feeling locked somewhere behind plate glass, out of reach. Since then, she has not spoken. Not one word. She screams, she throws things, she bites. The last placement required urgent care at the Montreal General. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossing. I'm not a man accustomed to problems I cannot solve. My daughter is a problem I cannot solve. From somewhere deep in the house came the sound. Not a scream exactly, more like a sustained, furious wail that rose and then cut off suddenly, replaced by a crash. Céleste didn't flinch. Luca noticed. The other 4 flinched, he said. I heard a lot of those sounds growing up, Céleste said. Grief sounds different than anger. That was grief. Another silence. Longer. Show her in, Luca said to no one in particular, and Sylvie appeared from somewhere to lead Céleste toward the east wing of the house. They heard Mathilde before they saw her. The room was a child's room that had been designed by someone with a great deal of money and no particular understanding of what children need. Everything expensive, everything pristine, nothing soft. The toys were untouched in their bins. The books were stacked in perfect order on the shelf. A small figure in white pajamas was in the corner, her back to the room, rocking slightly, her dark curls tangled. The caregiver on duty, a pale young man who looked like he'd been crying recently, backed toward the door with visible relief. Céleste walked in. She didn't rush toward Mathilde. She didn't call her name or make the bright, cheerful sounds adults make when they're frightened of a child and trying to hide it. She simply crossed to the middle of the room, lowered herself to the floor, slowly, because her knees weren't built for quick movements and because she refused to be ashamed of that, and sat. She picked up a small wooden giraffe that had been knocked off a shelf and turned it over in her hands. Mathilde's rocking slowed. That's a long neck, Céleste said, to no one. Her voice was the voice she'd used with her father when he came home from 16-hour shifts, barely able to lift his arms. Low, warm, arriving without demand. I always wondered how giraffes sleep. All that neck seems exhausting. From the corner, the rocking stopped entirely. Céleste kept her eyes on the giraffe. You know what I think? I think maybe giraffes get tired of everybody staring at what makes them different. And then, one day somebody just sits down next to them and doesn't say anything about the neck at all. And that feels so good they could cry. A small sound came from the corner. Not language, but not rage either. Mathilde turned around. She had her father's eyes, that same grey that looked almost black, and her mother's bone structure probably, and a particular expression of a child who has been so sad for so long that sadness has become the default setting. She stared at Céleste with a flat, evaluating gaze of someone who has been disappointed by every adult in recent memory and is simply waiting to add another name to the list. Céleste held out the giraffe. Mathilde looked at it, looked at Céleste. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a child making an extremely important decision, she crossed the room, took the giraffe, and sat down directly on Céleste's lap. She was a small, warm, solid weight, and she pressed her face against the soft roundness of Céleste's shoulder, and made a sound that was not a word but was, unmistakably, a sigh of relief. In the doorway, Luca Ferrante stood perfectly still. His head of security, a man named Dario, stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Luca had been in rooms where men begged for their lives and felt less moved than he did in this moment. He cleared his throat, adjusted his cufflinks. looked at Dario, who was staring open-mouthed. "Tell Mrs. Fortier the position is filled," he said, barely above a whisper. "Cancel the remaining interviews." He looked back into the room, where Céleste was humming something low and rhythmic, one wide, warm hand stroking Matilda's curls, the child limp against her in a way she hadn't been in 14 months. "And whatever she was making before," Luca said, "we're doubling it. She lives here now." The weeks that followed were the strangest of Céleste's life. She moved into a room in the East Wing that was larger than her entire Pointe-Saint-Charles apartment, with a clawfoot tub and a view of the garden and a bed so soft she initially couldn't sleep in it, lying awake in the unfamiliar quiet and listening to the sound of a house that was used to holding its breath. She brought almost nothing with her: a duffel bag of clothes, her mother's Bible, and a cast-iron pot her father had carried from Lagos to Montreal in 1997 and which she used for everything. Sylvie watched her for the first 3 days with the expression of a woman expecting disaster. Then she walked into the kitchen at 7 in the morning and found Céleste making jollof rice and soft-boiled eggs for Mathilde's breakfast. The little girl balanced on a stool beside her at the counter wearing an apron 3 sizes too large. Stirring things very seriously, Sylvie made a sound that might have been a laugh. Might have been. It was hard to tell. Céleste didn't discipline Mathilde with time-outs or raised voices, or the anxious, negotiating energy of adults who are afraid of a child's feelings. She moved around her like weather, present, warm, without pressure. When Mathilde had a meltdown over the color of her socks, a 40-minute event that had previously exhausted every adult in the house, Céleste sat on the bathroom floor with her, matched her breathing, and narrated what was happening in the same low voice she used for everything. "The feelings are really big right now. That's okay. Big feelings don't last forever. They move through you like a storm moves through. And then there's the after." On the 11th day, in the middle of lunch, Mathilde looked up from her soup and said, "More." It was one word. But Sylvie had to leave the kitchen. Luca was at a meeting downtown when it happened, when Céleste texted him. Because she had his number now, given for emergency purposes, he read the single sentence she'd sent, set down his phone, and excused himself from a room full of men who did not normally see him need a moment. He started coming home earlier. He told himself it was to spend time with Mathilde, which was true. He told himself it was not also because of the way the house smelled different now, like cardamom and clean laundry and something baking, and the way Mathilde's laughter moved through the halls like something that had been locked up and was finally learning what open felt like. He told himself he wasn't specifically listening for the sound of Céleste's voice, low and warm and steady, reading to Mathilde from books she'd picked up at the used bookstore on Notre Dame on her day off. He was not successful in convincing himself of any of this. He started finding reasons to be in the kitchen in the evenings. He told himself this was coincidental. It was not coincidental. "You're baking again," he said one Thursday night. Standing in the archway of the industrial kitchen in his suit jacket, tie loosened, looking like a man who had spent 10 hours making problems disappear and was mildly annoyed to find himself in a room that smelled like butter and brown sugar. Céleste jumped slightly, knocking a measuring cup against the bowl. "Mr. Ferrante, sorry, I didn't hear you." She set a hand against her chest, catching her breath, her cheeks flushing the deep, warm brown of someone genuinely startled. "I couldn't sleep. I hope it's okay. I was going to make maple butter tarts for Mathilde's breakfast." At 11:30 at night, she said she liked the ones Sylvie described from before. Céleste turned back to the counter, working dough with practiced hands, the movement easy and grounded. "I thought if I started them tonight, they'd be ready by morning." Luca walked closer. The kitchen lights caught the flour on her forearm, the slight dampness at her temple from the oven's heat. She was wearing a loose dress in a dark green that had nothing to do with the stiff, formal uniforms the agency usually sent people in, and she moved in her own space without apology, taking up room the way someone does when they've finally been given permission. "I make people nervous," he said. "I've been nervous since I got here. she said pleasantly, without stopping. I've just decided not to perform it. He almost smiled. It was rare enough to be notable. You're feeding the security team too, I hear, he said. Dario mentioned they usually eat vending machine sandwiches on the overnight shift. She glanced up briefly. A person can't protect anything properly on a vending machine sandwich. You've taken it upon yourself to feed my entire operation. Just the ones who stand outside in the cold. She turned to look at him directly, and her eyes were steady and warm and entirely unafraid. I'm not trying to overstep. I know my place here. Luca closed the distance between them. He was a man who moved slowly when he meant to be taken seriously. And he moved slowly now. You don't know your place here, he said quietly. No one does. You've changed it. He reached out and did something he hadn't planned. His hand rose and very carefully brushed a streak of flour from her cheek, his thumb resting there for one extra beat. Celeste went very still. You came in here with a duffel bag, Luca said, low. And in 3 weeks you've made my daughter speak. Made my security staff loyal to you. And made me come home before midnight for the first time in a year. Don't apologize for the space you take up, don't you dare. She looked at him for a long moment, and something moved across her face, not the grateful humility he might have expected, but something raw, the specific emotion of a person who has been told their whole life that they are too much, finding out suddenly they are not enough, that they were always, in fact, exactly right. She turned back to the dough. The tarts will be ready by 7, she said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady. He stayed in the kitchen for another hour, reading case files at the island counter, saying very little. It was the most comfortable he had felt in 14 months. The threat arrived on a grey Tuesday morning in November, the way bad things often do, wrapped in the ordinary. Celeste had taken Matilda to the park at the end of the block. A short walk, always accompanied by Dario at a discreet distance, always within sight of the gate. Matilda was on the swings, demanding to go higher with increasing confidence, the new words arriving in small, bright bursts. A man sat down on the bench beside Celeste. He was thin, with the particular shabbiness of someone who had made bad choices for a long time and expected other people to pay for it. He smelled of cigarettes and cold coffee. He smiled at Celeste with teeth that had seen better decades. You're the girl working for Ferrante, he said. Celeste felt the cold before it moved. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. My name's Terence Galt. He said it like it should mean something. I do collections work for the Beaumont crew out of Verdun. Ferrante's been squeezing our territory for 6 months. We've been trying to get a line inside that house. He glanced at Matilda on the swing. You're the line. No, Celeste said. Her voice didn't shake. Inside, something had gone very cold and very clear. I'm not. You don't understand how this works, sweetheart. Don't call me that. He leaned closer. I need the rotation schedule for his private security. Who's on the East Gate overnight when the camera systems do their maintenance cycle? Small stuff. You get me that by Saturday. You walk away clean. You don't. He glanced at Matilda again. The implication was not subtle. Celeste looked at the man beside her. She looked at Matilda, who had spotted her from the swing and was waving with both arms, grinning, all that new language bubbling up. You're threatening a child, Celeste said, to use me to get to her father. I'm being practical. Get away from me, she said, voice flat as iron. Right now. She stood, walked to Matilda, lifted her from the swing, and carried her back toward the gate without looking back. She was shaking by the time Dario reached her, and she told him everything before they were through the door. For 3 days, she didn't tell Luca. Not because she intended to comply with Terence Galt. She would die before she did that. She didn't tell Luca, because she was trying to find a way out of it that didn't require him to know how thoroughly she had complicated his life simply by existing in it. She thought about leaving. She packed the duffel bag twice, and then unpacked it both times, because she could hear Matilda in the next room asking Sylvie where Celeste was. She couldn't leave. But she couldn't stay and be a danger to them either. On the third night, Luca found her sitting in the dark in Matilda's room, watching the little girl sleep. Celeste had her knees drawn up, her wide arms wrapped around them, and she was crying the specific kind of cry of someone trying very hard not to make noise. He didn't turn the light on. "Tell me," he said. And she did. Everything. The bench in the park, Terence Galt, the Beaumont crew, the threat. The 3 days of trying to figure it out alone. When she was done, she kept her face turned away. "I was going to leave," she said. "I don't want to be a problem for you. I'm the maid, Luca. I shouldn't have..." "Stop." His voice wasn't loud. It had the absolute bedrock quality of something that has decided. He came forward and knelt in front of her chair, the way she had knelt in front of her Tildy on the first night, and he took both her hands in his. "You are not the maid," he said. And the way he said it made it feel like a different sentence entirely, like the rearrangement of something fundamental. "You are the reason that child in there is sleeping without screaming. You are the reason I came home tonight and the night before and every night for 3 weeks. You are the safest thing in this house." He pressed her hands between his. "Nobody threatens my family without consequences. And you, Celeste, you are my family." She looked at him. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "I'll handle Terence Galt." Saturday night came in with freezing rain that turned the Montreal streets to black mirrors in an abandoned warehouse complex in Pointe St. Charles, not far, in fact, from the apartment building where Celeste had grown up. Terence Galt waited with 3 of his crew, nervous in the way of men who have overestimated their own position. He kept checking his phone. He kept telling his people she'd come through. The main door came off its hinges at 11:45. Not from an explosion, from the quiet, methodical efficiency of Luca Ferrante's people, who knew their work and did not enjoy waste. The overhead lights went on all at once, and by the time Galt's men had processed what was happening, they were face down on the concrete with their weapons gone, and their dignity not far behind. Luca walked in from the rain. His coat was dark with moisture. He wore no expression. Galt tried to negotiate. He cited alliances, applied threats, named names. He was still talking when Luca crouched in front of him, unhurried. "You sat next to a woman in a park," Luca said, "and you looked at the 3-year-old girl on a swing and decided she was useful." He was quiet for a moment. The rain hammered the roof. "There's nothing left to negotiate." He stood. "Send what's left of the Beaumont operation a message," he said to Dario behind him. "The Plateau, NDG, Verdun, all of it. Anyone who looks at my address again loses the right to look at anything." It was back on De la Montagne before 1 in the morning. The lights were on in the East Wing. He went there first. Celeste was pacing in the small sitting room adjacent to her bedroom, still dressed, her hands knotted together. When the door opened and she saw him, unharmed, present, real, the sound she made was involuntary and embarrassing. And she didn't care about either. She crossed the room and wrapped both arms around him, all of her, without calculating whether she had the right, and he caught her so easily, it seemed like he'd been braced for it. "It's done," he said, his mouth against her hair. She held on. He let her. "You didn't have to do that," she said when she finally pulled back enough to look at him. Her eyes were wet, and she didn't try to hide it. "I'm not. I know what I am here. I know I'm not the kind of woman that someone like you, Celeste." He said her name the way you say the thing you've been meaning to say for a while. He lifted a hand to her face, cupped her jaw, tipped her chin up until her eyes met his. "I have been surrounded my entire adult life by people who wanted something from me. Power, money, protection. People who smiled and calculated." His thumb moved along her cheek. "You walked into my house with $43. She blinked. "How do you know that?" "I know everything about the people under my roof." A ghost of a real smile. "You walked in with $43 in a cast iron pot, and in 3 weeks you made my daughter laugh. You fed my guards. You sat in the dark crying rather than risk endangering Matilda. His voice dropped. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever let through those gates. Don't tell me what kind of woman you are. I know exactly what kind of woman you are. He kissed her. It wasn't tentative. It was the kiss of a man who's been making decisions his entire life and has just made another one, certain, complete, and without room for revision. Céleste kissed him back. She had spent her whole life being told to make herself smaller, smaller opinions, smaller appetite, smaller presence, smaller hope. She had been taught that a body like hers was a problem to be managed, an apology to be made. She had been told, in 100 different ways, by the sideways glances and the application rejections and the love that never quite arrived, that she was too much. In Luca Ferrante's arms, with his hands in her hair and the Montreal rain against the window, she understood for the first time that all of that had been wrong. Not a little wrong. Fundamentally, categorically, entirely wrong. She was not too much. She had never been too much. She was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough. The winter came early that year, burying the Westmount streets under 2 feet of snow that Matilda considered a personal gift. She pressed her face against the window at 6 in the morning and demanded, in complete and escalating sentences, to go outside immediately. Céleste dressed her in 4 layers. Luca, who had not owned snow pants since childhood and had to send Dario to mountain equipment on a Saturday morning for a pair, stood in the garden in his good coat looking mildly ridiculous and completely at peace. Matilda made him hold her mittened hand the whole time. The women on the security team started coming to the kitchen on Saturday mornings. Then a couple of the men, Céleste, cooked for whoever was there. Big pots, her mother's recipes, her grandmother's recipes, things that had crossed oceans in the memory of people who learned early that food is the way you say you matter, you belong, you are not alone. Sylvie sat at the kitchen island one Saturday in December and accepted a bowl of pepper soup and said, very quietly, that it was the best thing she'd eaten in years. Luca stood in the doorway and watched his house become a home. He'd built an operation on fear and precision and the cold arithmetic of power. He'd thought for a long time that this was what safety looked like. He understood now that he had been wrong. Not about power, exactly, but about what it was for. Safety wasn't the locked gate. It wasn't the cameras or the protocols or the men with earpieces standing at attention. Safety was a woman humming at a kitchen counter while his daughter stirred soup with enormous concentration. Safety was laughter in a house that had forgotten how to make the sound. He crossed the kitchen and, without saying anything, stood behind Céleste and rested his chin on the top of her head, his arms coming around her, and she leaned back into him, easy as breathing, and kept stirring. Matilda looked up from her bowl and studied them with the serene confidence of a 3-year-old who has decided something important. More, she said, pushing her bowl forward, and everyone in the kitchen laughed. If this story found you somewhere you needed it, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that the most important people are sometimes the ones nobody expected. Subscribe to Mafia Lord and Me for more stories about love that rise where it's least expected and stays where it's most needed. And drop a comment below. Do you think it was Matilda who opened Luca's heart first? Or was it Céleste herself?